I'm old. Not in any real sense. In the real world, I'm still relatively young. To give you an idea of my actual age, if I were to die, people would very much say, "Oh God, he's gone too soon." But he really should have known better than to play with those fireworks. However, in internet terms, I am old. My birth year starts with a 1, making me a certified relic. Go ahead, call me Unk or Gramps, just not both, as I think that's trademarked. This means I've had a very privileged position throughout my life where I've been around for more or less all of YouTube, Twitch, and modern game media history. Hell, I remember when it was called Just In TV. I'll have you know we had to hike 3 miles uphill to hear famous streamers being exposed for inappropriate DMs. And this means I've seen all manner of popular indie horror come and go over the years, which has led to me compiling this list of games which were, at one point or another, all the rage, but are now largely unheard of, if not almost entirely forgotten. And along the way, I want to see if they still hold up. But before we do jump into it, I must explain that this is a fully objective list and absolutely not just the games I personally remember from Let's Players in like 2013. How dare you insinuate such a thing? 1916 was a busy year. It was a leap year, for starters, the toggle light switch was invented, the 40-hour work week was born, and as the real lore heads out there might know, there was something of a war going on. And coming well before other similarly set horror games such as Conscript and Amnesia the Bunker, 2011's 1916 Der Unbekannte Krieg was on the cutting edge of telling us that it was quite a horrid time. The game's premise is quite straightforward. You, as a German soldier on the Western Front, must escape the trenches. Alas, there's a bunch of fucking dinosaurs in there with you, and that's not where they're meant to be. And so begins the horror. Upon launching the game, it lets you choose between 2 languages, Danish or English, and regardless of what you pick, the game itself is in German. The illusion of choice. And then we're thrown right in. Our objective is to finde die Leiter, or find the ladder, and preferably not die in the process. Now, I remember this game being scary as hell when it came out, and I certainly wasn't alone in that, but let's see if it's held up. Well, immediately I have to point out the visuals. There's a lot going on here. It's extremely desaturated, there's film grain, chromatic aberration, and a slight green tint to everything. Now, in the past I've been very critical of visual effect overuse, especially for more recent games, but I'm all for it here. It serves a purpose. It's attempting to emulate the look of real World War I footage, and I say it comes pretty close. It could lose the chromatic aberration though, because there's not typically a tremendous amount of chroma to aberrate in most 1910s video footage. And also, keep in mind, this is a 2011 game. It was well ahead of the curve, and it's not really chasing any trends with its visuals, so it should be applauded for this. But those elements aren't necessarily scary, just atmospheric. I'd say the narrow aspect ratio and even narrower setting of the deep trenches are what begins to make me uneasy. There are few games I've played that both look and feel as claustrophobic as this, and that's before the giant dinosaurs start screaming and sprinting at you. And that really is quite frightening, if not a little odd, because these raptors are genuinely huge and you will have a very tough time passing them. Most of the time you'll just end up running away very quickly with a healthy dose of camera shake, and God forbid you've reached the gas mask section if you are a fan of seeing anything. What really adds to the claustrophobia and kind of paranoia of what's going on is the fact that the place is a maze. It's not a huge area, but it doesn't have to be. You can see by watching just how easy it is to get disoriented and in many cases run directly into a second or maybe third raptor. There is a little safe zone which includes an actual map of the place, but it's not really the most helpful thing in practice, because again, you'll get disoriented, be it by the horrors of teeth and claws or the shock of bombs landing overhead. It's not entirely a run and hide type game though. You do have some ways to defend against or distract the raptors. You can get a gun which stuns them briefly, you can get some flares which I believe stops them in their tracks for a while, and the way the game handles the resources for these is really cool. There's not really any UI in the game, so if you want to see how many bullets or flares you have to look down at your bandolier. That's a nice touch. But unfortunately, both flare and bullet pale in comparison to the real MVP of raptor defense, which is, naturally, bits of people. When you see a body of a fellow soldier, you can cut off one of their hands or feet and throw it on the ground to distract the dinos, which is, in a slapstick sense, very funny, but every other sense quite bleak. Well, I say you can take the flesh from bodies, but you can find this one weird guy kind of jerking around. and you can't take his flesh. Frankly, I don't want it. Something that the game doesn't do so well is the dinosaur audio. Sure, when they see you, they scream and charge forward, but after that, they don't really make a peep. So you might not know you're being chased at any given point, and that's a shame. But the rest of the audio is fantastic. As you play, you hear gunshots, explosions, cries of pain, and everything else you'd expect from a war. Unpleasant stuff, but very atmospheric. The game is short and also kind of tricky. You can take a few hits from the raptors and survive, but you can also get caught between two of them and then beaten to death with no hope for escape, which takes a surprising amount of time for two giant evil birds. Also, you may have noticed that the dinosaurs are, in fact, metal in several senses of the word, but most pressingly in the material kind. You might ask why they're metal, but I think Jurassicing the wrong questions, my friend. Although it is likely meant to mirror the industrial killing machine aesthetics of the war, or maybe they just wanted to make the coolest villains in human history. There's a big cool dead Triceratops you can find that was probably killed by like a big cool Spinosaurus or some such. Or maybe a bomb. At the very start of the game, you can see the tail of one of the raptors disappear around a corner. I thought that was a really cool hint at what's to come, and it's also plenty ominous. A lot of games do this, where they sort of tease a monster to get you revved up before the action actually starts. But in 1916, the raptor tease isn't a tease. The dinosaur is actually there, and if you are fast enough right off the bat, you can catch up to it and doom yourself immediately. There is no way to escape. Good stuff. But yeah, the game can be hard. The first time I succeeded, I skipped the gun altogether and relied entirely on the extremities of my friends and comrades to survive, and not in a way they'd enjoy. And at the end, we find the ladder to escape in a pit of fallen soldiers and we leave. But of course, as is tradition in really any World War I media, that small victory doesn't matter. The war still goes on. That's something I've always appreciated about World War I media. I don't know how it's perceived elsewhere, but here in the UK, there is a great deal of pride surrounding World War II. We fought the fascists, and alongside our allies, we stormed the beaches and helped liberate Europe from the pretty clear-cut villains. But when it comes to World War I, we just get sad. We don't see it with the same sense of righteousness. Don't get me wrong, it's still there in part, but more often it's the politicians and generals that sent countless troops to die that are viewed with disdain, and every side had those. It was an old war fought with brutal new tools that tore everyone to shreds. So I appreciate when World War I media doesn't celebrate anything and it's just pure tragedy. But hey, at least it was the war to end all wars. It's a uniquely bleak setting that creates some incredibly powerful media, be it horror like this and the other games I mentioned earlier, drama like All Quiet on the Western Front, or in some rare cases, even comedy. The last episode of Blackadder Goes Forth is still one of the most gut-wrenching pieces of British television ever made, and nobody better make a fucking House reference. All that said, I still don't quite know where the dinosaurs fit into this World War I equation. I feel like they represent something specific, rather than sort of being a cover-all for the horrors of war. Discuss in the comments. I mean, the game title is Der Unbekannte Krieg, or The Unknown War, so maybe this actually happened and they just, forgot to write it down. That'd be fucking crazy, wouldn't it? So, did this game hold up over time? In my opinion, yeah, absolutely. If you can look past some classic Unity engine clunk, it's still a very tense experience. It's not that far removed from the indie horror games of today being released on things like itch.io, and in some ways it's got a bit more going on than many of them do. And with its creative visuals, claustrophobia, ominous setting, and general bleakness, the game is a lot of what, Sad Satan wanted to be, but 4 years earlier and substantially more coherent. It's a shame there aren't more World War I dinosaur tragedies out there, but I'd also be open to a World War II dinosaur triumph to balance things out. Not super likely to happen though. But for now, this was a much stronger start than I was expecting. Let's see if it carries on. I think a lot of people have forgotten how huge Source Engine mods used to be. Sure, there are some that are still pretty well known, like Gary's Mod, Black Mesa, and the Stanley Parable, but most have drifted into obscurity. There were some real classics in the late 2000s and early 2010s, both single player and multiplayer. The Hidden, Nightmare House 2, which was going to be in this video, but something recently happened, The Ship, and of course, who could forget Dino D-Day? Huh. But one of the more memorable ones for me was Underhell. Underhell was one of the most ambitious and hyped indie projects of the early Let's Play days, but nowadays it's only ever sort of mentioned in a what could have been sense. Let's look at why. The game opens with an incredibly hard 3D text intro, think Minecraft tutorials from 2012. This naturally happening over a big pool of ominous red fluid after a very ominous warning that we're definitely in a coma, or injured, or otherwise inconvenienced, which is a classic for psychological horror. Then we get a very artistic slow shot through the house, showing us what appears to be a sort of ominous but near picturesque image of upper middle class suburban life, which is a classic for both psychological and supernatural horror. It eventually reaches us just lying on a couch watching a live feed of a terrorist attack. We don't seem to mind the terrorists too much, even though we get a phone call telling us that it's very much our job to worry about it. And then we're just thrown into it. This house serves as the game's hub area, and we get a cool little tutorial where we're shown that we have to do like a trillion things all over the place, including answering the phone, checking mail, both ethereal and physical, solving puzzles and or mysteries, opening locked doors, collecting key items. It's very in-depth and a little overwhelming, especially because, keep in mind, we have an active terrorist attack to sort out. But, I suppose the terrorists can wait. Ghouls take priority. And yeah, here we are. Welcome to Underhell, a game where you walk around your house and avoid doing your job. One of the first things I interact with says, "This is my wife's chest. I've never looked inside," and odd wording aside, this rings the psychological horror bell once again, and this time in the distinct dead wife flavor. I must say, I really enjoy walking around doing adventure game stuff here. There's a certain ominous feeling to all of it, which I really appreciate. There are a lot of micro scares going on while you walk around the house. You may hear a floorboard creak suddenly or a door close behind you. It manages to catch a vibe similar to other games like Scratches, and it does so in a similar way of promising big scares often through tension alone, but rarely actually executing them. That may sound boring to you, but believe me, once you've liked horror for long enough, you may begin to feel that restraint is way more effective as an atmospheric tool than shock. However, unlike point-and-click horror games such as Scratches with a similar premise to this, we do unfortunately have to pick up and drag around all of the key items one by one, which finally adds the one element that point-and-click horror games have been missing for years: slapstick. While exploring the house, I find a page out of my dead wife's diary. There are apparently many to find in the game, and the very first one I find is of her talking about September 11th. For some reason. There are definitely a lot of references to terrorism in this game, and a whole lot of us not quite dealing with it, but ultimately our dead wife believes that the alien she saw that day is a little bit more pressing, which once again readjusts the hierarchy as such. Checking the emails on your computer is an interesting time. There's only a few of them there, but there's quite a lot to dissect. Firstly, nobody that puts "my deepest condolences" in the subject line ends an email with "talk to you soon, bro," ellipses. Secondly, can we just talk about this whole screen? First of all, almost everybody's email domain is at awesomemail.com. If that doesn't tell you when this game came out, I don't know what will. Thirdly, why do we have so many fucking Counter-Strike icons on our taskbar? And why is one of them in the system tray? And finally, while I was writing this note, I forgot to pause the game, which is important because the hub area acts on a day-night cycle, and a really fast one at that. And whenever night falls, spooky things start happening around the house at an accelerated rate, like doors opening and then locking before you can enter, phones ringing but with no apparent caller, and, most frighteningly, it gets a little bit darker. The game sort of urges you to go to bed at this point, but I elect not to. And remember, that terrorist attack is still ongoing, and I'm quite late. Near the bed, I find a box of my wife's old belongings, and it tells me I can't throw them away yet. I beg to differ. Alright, so I have to be honest. I played through the entire house section of the game before actually recording it, so I knew what to focus on during the recording process. I know, I'm a fraud, but something I did not do was fuck around with the bed all that much. So when I loaded into the game after restarting it, I unknowingly launched into something new. The first time I played through this, I encountered one minor scare, that being my dead wife walking past a door. So I wasn't expecting much more in the way of scares. But then the game hit me with this. In fact, after waking up post-jump scare, which tend to knock you out for some reason, I assumed that things had gone back to normal. But then, this happened to me. This is an incredibly unique experience because it feels like the game is actually haunted. I swear, neither of those events happened to me the first time around. Hell, I even went back and did the whole thing again for a third time, and it didn't happen there either. But by digging through the game files, I think I figured it out. There seems to be, beyond just random chance for scares to happen, several versions of the house that you can load into. And it seems like the bed, or alternatively quitting and reloading, dictate which one you are in at any given time. So when you get one of the more violent scares, you wake up in a safer version. At least I think that's how it works. I might be wrong about that, and I don't particularly care. I like that mystery. And in any case, there's some pretty ambitious game design going on there. So by watching this, you might get the impression that Underhell is a haunted house puzzle game. You'd be dead wrong. It's an action-heavy, tactical FPS game with a haunted house puzzle game just sort of grafted on the side. So, what's the main game like? Well, somehow I managed to get a different crash each time I tried to launch into it. After spending genuinely like 2 nights troubleshooting, I finally got it to work. The trick is finding a good amount of RAM to allocate to the game via Steam's startup settings, while also installing a RAM patcher to source SDK 2007, while also using a specific version of DirectX that required trial and error to figure out. What's funny about PC gaming is that some people will scoff at that and claim it was a very straightforward fix that I should have thought of immediately, and others will have no fucking clue what I'm talking about. Variety is the spice of life. And after all that effort, and finally getting into the main bulk of the game, here's what I have to say about it. It's a tactical shooter in the Source engine. I know some people are all about that kind of thing, and power to them, but that power is certainly not directed towards me. Underhell dares to ask the question, what if we made a game that was 30% spooky haunted house and 70% everyone getting in the fucking way? The prologue, the first mission available, took me like a full hour or more to clear, and I'm certain that the first full chapter of the game would take me way longer than that. And in that entire time, I don't think there was any horror at all. There's some like Deus Ex conspiracy stuff, some sci-fi gubbins, a few violent moments, but it's not like creepy ghost wife, oh dear, but now with guns. It's very much its own thing. I mean, there is a lot going on with the plot, but I'm fairly certain that next to none of it has anything to do with the spooky house section, minus us playing as the same character. I imagine the 2 stories converge at some point within the 5-chapter game, but as of right now, only 1 chapter was ever released, 13 years ago. However, I am assured that the others are coming soon. The main game can be really clunky, especially when driving or dealing with your fellow SWAT members. I forgot to mention you're a SWAT officer, that's why the terrorism things were relevant to you. It's also one of those shooters where it's near impossible to see anything at any given time because of recoil, muzzle effects, and general visual noise. But if I was to give it any positives, I would say this. It's one of the few games that gets shotguns right. Correct protocol for when a combatant has a shotgun in an open space at close to medium range is call a priest. I know it sounds like I didn't like the game, but it was more that I was disappointed at the complete tone and gameplay shift between the different sections. I may as well have been playing a totally different game altogether. But just you wait, there's still more to unpack with Underhell. When I beat the prologue and go back to the spooky haunted house section, I decide to explore yet another section of the game. Yup, there's a third type of game in here. Now we're playing Penumbra Requiem. You access these dream areas by sleeping in the house without a dream catcher equipped. And it seems that for each chapter there's about 4 dream levels where you do various dream things like avoid lights or skip platforming sections or get chased by a man. And it reveals some lore each time you get to the end of one of these levels, but again, it's an unfinished game. It feels like getting invested in the lore is a little bit sad. They are cool levels, however. I really do mean it when I say it's like Penumbra Requiem, but I have no idea if that's even a remotely relatable reference to anyone. Like 15 people have played Requiem and 8 enjoyed it. But anyway, the house gets notably more spooky after the first shooter mission, with the whole aesthetic becoming notably colder and darker and with more areas opening up. Lights flicker and birds circle around the house. Very loudly as well, which is not ideal. I find a dead bird on the living room table, which is also not ideal, but fortunately it is quite fun to play with. They, for whatever reason, didn't limit the amount of blood it can leak.
View my twisted masterpiece.
Despite being thrown in the trash next to my wife's belongings, the bird returns and breaks my window. Bastard.
Sequels are always better.
Eventually I find myself down in a well which leads to some kind of sewer. In there are some bodies and a selection of audio tapes, and yeah, they're pretty fucked up.
I'm afraid to remove the rest of my clothes. It looks like they've been burned straight into my skin. I don't have proper lighting. I can't examine my wounds efficiently. I don't know exactly what happened. But every time I try to pull, it just starts ripping off. It's also dark. I can't tell what's clothing and what's skin.
And guess what? This section, down the well, is an entirely different game type too. It's a full-blown, like, Amnesia style thing, complete with weird visuals when staring at the enemy. It's cool and atmospheric, but good heavens, have you noticed this game's potential flaw? It's trying to be everything, and props to it. It sort of succeeds, but it means the player experience is wildly inconsistent. It has the problem that a lot of indie games have, where they have so many ideas going on at once, and rather than excelling at one and having a really concise and strong identity, it feels all over the place. Like, who is this game aimed at? One of the best things you can do when creating any kind of media is to rein yourself in a little bit. Work within your means. If you want to make a mystery house exploration game, do it. A story-heavy action FPS game, do that. An abstract puzzle dreamlike thingy, sure, that's fine as well. Hell, any two of these things could potentially work together really nicely, but all three at once? Can you name anything that actually succeeded at that? Well, yes, actually. Black Ops 6, weirdly enough. It did that pretty much exactly, but instead of a haunted house, it's like a spy house. Hell, it even has the Amnesia element, but in a different sense. My point is, ambition is great, but you don't need to put it all into one project. Give your ideas the space they need to thrive. Because if you don't, more often than not, it causes you to spread yourself way too thin, and then you end up releasing one chapter of your 5-chapter game with the last community update being 9 years ago. Ah shit, somebody already beat me to the inevitable joke. Never before has low-hanging fruit been so pitifully out of reach. But anyway, did this hold up as a horror game? Well, it's a mixed bag. The house part is genuinely really nice, if not short and unfinished. It scratches an itch for the kind of ominous mystery adventure gameplay that I love to see in horror games. And talking about scratching, it reminds me of Scratches, and that's nice. It's one of my favorite horror games ever, and I don't get to talk about it all too often. And that's a shame. I have no idea when I'll next be able to naturally bring that up. The main body of the game, though, it's not really horror at all. It's impressive and incredibly ambitious, but again, not scary, nor does it really try to be. The dream sections are cool, albeit very short, and have a nice aesthetic to them, but their main function is to serve a plot that will never be resolved. And the section in the well, while it includes some very good horror writing, it's kind of underwhelming compared to even its contemporaries that attempted the same gameplay and atmosphere. So yeah, Underhell is a complicated one. I wonder what could have been had the developers committed to just one of these ideas and put their very clear talent to a more focused use. Now, I've spent a lot of time on these first 2 games, but don't worry, the next few are much shorter. However, I don't want to end this section on a downer, so let's do something fun. This is a Source Engine game, and that means we can no-clip around and explore some of the hidden areas, like this side room which is always locked in regular gameplay, this spooky underground box with the creepy well man in it, and this bathroom next to our bedroom which we never get to enter. You guys remember Scratches? Well, Senscape, the company formed by one of the head Scratches developers, head Scratches is not the best terminology. Senscape, the company formed by one of the lead Scratches developers, have been working on another game for a while now, that being Asylum, a game famous for its strong roots in the point-and-click horror genre, with some very notable inspirations from various pieces of classic horror media, and with, by most accounts, an incredibly talented writing and design team behind it. But all 3 of those things pale in comparison to what it is most famous for: not being out yet. Now, Asylum itself isn't forgotten horror at all. In fact, there's been a very active and dedicated community following the game through its development. What may be forgotten are the handful of demos and teasers that have come out for the game, including the 2020 demo that I covered 5 years ago, and also the topic of this section, the Asylum interactive teaser from 2012. In this, we take the role of someone exploring the titular asylum while complaining about dust and strange jars.
Looks like some kind of organ. I'll be damned if I know which one. On second thought, that seems to be a lung.
And truly, Interactive Teaser is the best name for what this is. It's incredibly short, it's like 5 rooms and 3 of them are corridors, there's 1 key item to pick up and maybe 2 scares to be had. Though the purpose of this teaser is not to provide a full experience. It's meant to introduce us to the setting, the style, and the gameplay we'd come to expect from the full thing. And in that sense, it's really pretty strong. It, just like Scratches, is an oddly beautiful game. It's horrid and rotten, but we like that kind of thing here. The grotty and horrible nature of the asylum would be enough for the atmosphere alone, but the audio design here is also spectacular. It's foreboding and miserable, and I say that as someone who, on several occasions, has been to Aberdeen, so my standards are high. I think this atmosphere is one of the reasons that Asylum has been hyped for so long. Despite all of its delays and the controversies that may, rightfully, come along with that, Scratches and everything we've seen from Asylum so far are head and shoulders above most of the entire horror genre in terms of pure atmospheric quality, if nothing else. Even in this now relatively old and largely forgotten tech demo, it's impressive.
I better leave him alone. He seems upset.
Yeah, dude, maybe. But like I said, this is very short, and minus the bathroom man and a rather upset fellow at a window, there's not much in the way of scares. What you're seeing here is kind of what you get. However, there is something very fun that they not only included in the game, but actively encourage you to play around with. All of the game's assets and code are completely open source, so you can edit this game in really any way you want. Now, while I don't know much about Lua files and coding, I can change some things. First, I fiddled around with some of the images as a little test, like I did with, for example, this map. I modernized it. You can also fiddle with audio cues to match certain images like I did with this corkboard. Here's the before. And here's the after. And if you're feeling particularly ambitious, you can also edit the pre-rendered video clips. Here's the before.
Apparently they've already transferred some inmates.
And here's the after.
No, the thing in the fridge is definitely not human meat.
But yes, given the teaser's length, that's really all I have to say about it. If you want to see some more about Asylum or even Scratches, I would recommend my old videos on them, but I don't really like them. The Scratches one is better than the Asylum demo one, but it's still not great, so seek others.
Scratches is a very special game for me. I've known about it for around 12 years, and in those 12 years I've played every kind of horror game there is.
Why did I sound like that? Oh, Jesus. Here's a fun thing though, I genuinely got a ping on Discord while writing this section of video from the official Senscape Discord server itself announcing a Q&A before the game's release in, less than a month. What timing this is. I couldn't think of a good question to ask for the Q&A, so I asked if there would be any asbesto-spaced minigames, and power to Augustin, the lead developer, he responded really quickly with a, "Don't tempt me." I love it. And also, my timing later on could not have been better for this, because the day after I recorded all of this footage from the 2020 demo, it was revoked from all Steam accounts. I've decided I'll let the Lost Media YouTubers start bidding on this footage in a few months, and that is how I will make my billions. But somewhere between the approaching release of the full game and Underhell Chapter 2 releasing will come GTA 6. Remember friends, if the low-hanging fruit is out of reach, just wait for it to droop. But anyway, has the interactive teaser for Asylum aged well? In terms of game quality, sure. In terms of this closing screen? Probably not. There will be some of you watching who were born after this game was supposed to come out, and here's a fun thing you can do. Compile all of your memories and know that for the entirety of their scope, and more, people have been waiting for this game to come out. So it's going to be interesting to see how people react to the full thing. For me, I'm very excited. I can't wait to not sleep for like 5 days while I make a video about it. But for others, will it be worth the wait? I suppose that'll be the real test of how well this teaser has aged. I remember the game Candles being a more goofy approach to indie horror than many of its contemporaries. In this, you have to ensure that you're close enough to a light source at all times, otherwise a spooky imp will get you. And you do not want the spooky imp to get you because, oh god. Why is the camera doing that? I'm not playing this game, it's gonna make me quite unwell. Now this is a strange one, because I guarantee a lot of you won't have forgotten about this game, mostly because I think most of you, even those around at the time, will never have heard of it. But trust me when I say that it is one of the most impressive ahead of its time indie horror games out there. This is Hide. The goal of the game is to find 5 plaques hidden around a pretty wide snowy hill area. Each of the plaques have a crime written on them, and they are among the more gruesome of crimes, like driving 30 in a school zone or watching BBC iPlayer without a TV license. And it's implied that we either committed these crimes or were accused of them at the very least. Cancel culture at it once again. God forbid you starve someone to death in the year of our Lord 2011. For each plaque you find, a new foe will spawn. They will search for you and attempt to capture you. The foes range from regular men with flashlights to the dreaded TV detector zeppelins that the government warns us about. I remember seeing this game being played and not liking it whatsoever because of its aesthetics. My distaste for retro visuals has been with me for many years, but here it's on another level. It's easier to watch the game in video form, but when you're actually playing it, it's very, very difficult to parse what you're actually looking at a lot of the time. Now, you may have a question. How do I find these white plaques in a white world with exactly 9 pixels on screen at any given time? Well, this is where the game does something quite interesting. We listen for the plaques, of course. They make a funny little noise that grows in volume as we get closer. And you know what else does that? The growly men chasing us. Oh dear, growly men are among the worst kinds of men. Oh, I'll put them between ghouls and aliens. And there are also sirens blaring in the background near where you spawn, so you can kind of orient yourself with that. And your stamina level can also be determined by the rate of your character's breathing. Meaning that this game is almost entirely audio-based, which I can kind of get behind. I have to give it some credit. I came at it with an immediate dislike due to its visuals, but it really is quite creative in how it works around that. So keep that in mind while I also tell you that this game came before Slender the 8 Pages and has pretty similar gameplay. It even does the static screen thing when you get caught. This also came before Siren Head, and yet you are running through the woods while ominous sirens blare in the distance. And this also came before any indie retro aesthetic horror game that I'm aware of. And yet, I never hear Hide being mentioned. All it would have needed was an animatronic and some kind of distorted analog horror face, and it would have predicted every single trope of modern horror. I mean, hell, it even suggests that we were the bad guy all along. So with that in mind, it's aged really well, mostly because it can sort of act as a precursor for the decade of indie horror games that followed it in nearly every way. And the developer of Hide, Andrew Sholdis, is still around, and his website now links to a game called Tunic, which seems to have done really well. So yeah, that's all I have to say about this. Very positive, very cool, happy ending. Let's move on. Before I talk about this game, let's just shoot the elephant in the room before he becomes a problem. Yes, I say which, not which. Go ahead, type out your little which comments. In fact, fuck you, I'll beat you to it. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Yeah, I say Cool Whip. Fuck you. Your predictability will be your downfall. The horror game Which was released in 2010, making it the oldest game on this list by some margin. It's a short, heavily stylized game where you explore a little house to find keys and ultimately escape. It's a relatively simple formula, which I'm sure many of us have seen many times. And I'm going to say that, despite how many times this formula has been done, despite Which's mechanical simplicity, and despite its short length, this game rocks. And here's why. The story of the game, while unspoken, is quite clear. There are 2 of you in this house, the player character and an unknown woman who lacks both a heart and a head. But there is one problem. According to the drawings on the walls, only one of you can leave. Naturally, you want to be the one to leave because she's a scary, heartless, acephalous teleporter, which is certainly one of the earliest examples I can think of a weeping angel or SCP-173 type creature in an indie horror game, which is a cool thing to note. However, you kind of need to work with her in order to escape the house. And as you progress, you can give the woman either her head or her heart, which sounds like a big dramatic player choice, and it kind of is, but in reality it comes down to which key and door combination you find first. But anyway, if you lead her to her head, she picks it up and presumably uses her reclaimed brain to figure out the predicament you're in. She recognizes that only one of you can leave, and without a heart, she picks herself. In quite a stabby way. But don't judge her. God forbid a woman do anything. But if you lead her to her heart, she sacrifices herself and lets you leave instead. In also quite a stabby way. The game isn't exactly subtle in its messaging here, but I don't think it's trying to be. What really carries this game is its style. The tight aspect ratio makes this prison house feel a lot more claustrophobic, just like 1916 did. The black and white color scheme matches the game's themes. The audio design is spectacular, with really subtle choices like being able to hear the woman's detached head breathe quietly and her heart beat before she claims either of them. And also the distant, unreachable birds heard from behind the inescapable bars on the house's front door really kinda nail down what's going on here. The animations in the game are also very impressive for an indie game of the time, and frankly, even today. And it doesn't really matter if these animations were taken from elsewhere, which I think they were. I mean, other games of the time didn't take these animations, so this is still ahead. The only part of the style I don't particularly care for is the whole analog VHS thing that's going on. That doesn't seem to serve any purpose, but hey, it was among the first indie horror games to use that for no reason. So again, ahead of the curve. And all of these things come together to create a really strong atmosphere which surpasses a lot of newer games of similar types. I think another thing that helps is that the woman, despite stalking you around in an abrupt and silent manner, doesn't actually impede your progress. She's there to startle you and make you feel watched. It would be a different vibe altogether if making contact with her hurt or killed you. Then it would become too tactical in its gameplay. And that's fine in other games, but this is an atmosphere piece. You don't really want to be worrying about that. So instead, you can just run straight through her, and your only punishment is being hit with that transition that us YouTubers use as a modern-day laugh track. And that's really all there is to say about the game. It's short, effective, and way ahead of its time. But unfortunately, for the game's integrity, I found out you can also, just like in Asylum, edit the assets for this. I'm so sorry. Also, in a creative choice that didn't exactly catch on, the developer allows you to play the game in stereoscopic 3D, so that's something. I hope you kept those cheap card glasses they used to give out in cinemas. The developer of which is still active online, and from what I can tell is a very talented artist and animator. And I'm not certain, but I do believe he makes a certain kind of art which I cannot show on YouTube whatsoever. What a world. Now, I know some of you are going to put in the comments, "Oh, he made a game called Which? What's next? How, why, and where?" No. Those came before Which. Try and keep up. But yeah, this has been yet another game in this video that has aged really well. And that's that. I honestly approached this video expecting to find horror games that felt extremely dated and almost primitive in a way. That might sound overly presumptuous and even disrespectful, but 13, 14, 15 years is a very long time when it comes to video games, especially if you're an Asylum fan. But despite the massive changes in gaming culture and the online landscape at large, the indie horror games we play really haven't changed that much. Most of the games I looked at in this video would not feel out of place at the top of Itch.io's trending tab today. And maybe that's why several of these very influential and impressive games have been largely forgotten. We're not far enough removed from them to consider them nostalgic or part of history despite the relatively long time they've been around. They still fit today's expectations. And that's not even a quality unique to indie horror games. I mean, look at things like Amnesia and Outlast, which are still being used as a benchmark for so many things despite being over a decade old. And then, hell, even outside of horror, there's things like Minecraft, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, World of Warcraft. All of these are current games, and they have been current since before some or even many of you were born. When did history end? Fukuyama was a little too early, I reckon. I don't know if this lack of change is a glowing celebration of the culmination of our past creative successes or a scathing indictment of our willingness to stagnate. And I don't know if I want to think about that right now. Anyway, several of these games have aged particularly well for one reason or another, and that's a nice thing, despite them being largely forgotten by those who once played them or watched them being played. And I do think they deserve a little more recognition. Remember where we came from, and maybe toss a prayer or two to ensure we don't necessarily stay there. However, there are many more forgotten horror games to look at, and I already have a few lined up for the next installment in this series, like Phobia and various creepypasta or SCP games. But for now, if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments. And I'll see you next time.